Hey church, we're so glad that you tuned in with us for another weekly devotional. What we began doing last week is we began to look at the Lord's Prayer. And we began to look at the Lord's Prayer as a guide to how to pray. Because when Jesus is introducing the Lord's Prayer, he says, pray like this. Now, while it's good and fine to pray the Lord's Prayer verbatim, word for word, what I think Jesus really had in mind is that it serves as a paradigm for prayer, that it structures our prayer. Many of you are probably wondering, how do I pray? Like, what does a prayer look like? And particularly in this time where we're off our normal routines, it's good to explore how to pray. And last week we began talking about the foundation of prayer. It's who we are and who God is. God's our Father. He's utterly in control on the one hand, but he's intimately accessible and immanent on the other hand. And he's relational. And that's our foundation for prayer. What we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be talking about the purpose of prayer. It's the first petition. And the reason why it's first is because it's the most important. If you don't get this one down, then the rest of your prayers are going to be disordered. They're going to be out of whack. And what is the first thing we do? We're called to hallow God's name. And what does that mean? You don't often hear people use the word hallowed, right? I mean, who walks around on the street and says, hallowed be that, hallowed be this? No one says that, right? What does it mean? It simply means to set aside or literally to make holy. And the reason why we're making God's name holy is because a name in the ancient Near East had an inseparable connection with the person's attributes and character, unlike it does today. So when we're saying that God's name be hallowed, what we're really saying is that God is glorified first and foremost. God is set aside in a league of his own. You see, you often hear people say, God first, family second, job or whatever, kids third. Kids third if you have kids, and then job fourth. That's usually how it goes, right? And while I think that's totally true, on the one hand, I get where the sentiment's going. I think that this notion of hallowed be thy name, God's name set apart, what that really means is that God is the fundamental orienting drive to the whole list. So while, yeah, God is first and your family should be second, there's an element in which you love your family second so that it glorifies God. You love your kids third so that it glorifies God. You do your career well so that it glorifies God. Everything that we do has its fundamental goal in God's glory. That's the whole purpose of why we exist, is for his glory. Put differently, God is not just something that you compartmentalize on a Sunday morning or during your devotion time, or you just merely say your pithy praises to God at the beginning. Rather, God's glory is something that should orient every aspect of your prayers, but also every aspect of your life. But you see, the problem is, is that our fundamental default is not oriented that way. Our fundamental default is curved in on ourselves. We see our problems, and sometimes we don't even see that. We see our issues, we see what's immediately in our circumstance, and we're tending to focus on that. We lose sight of where we're going. Right, we're curved in on ourselves. My wife, Brenna, she had a dog, a little bear that was like 18, which is like 12 million years in dog years. And he was so old and he just kept fighting, right? But he had this problem where his spine was curved. It was kind of disgusting and sad at the same time. And whenever he'd walk, he would kind of, if he walked long enough, he would actually just walk in a circle because his spine was curved, right? When you're curved in on yourself, you don't stay in a straight line, you lose track. And that's kind of how our hearts are. Just a couple more examples on that. I had an old Toyota Corolla, and I'm sure you guys have all had your front end down a line. If you're ever on a highway and you let that sucker go, what's going to happen? It's slowly going to drift off. To use another example, if you're a pilot and you have your coordinates set to somewhere 300-400 miles away, and you're just a couple of degrees off, and you fly and you fly and you fly and you fly, the further you go along, the further you're actually going to get from your destination. You're going to be more and more off course the longer you go. And so it's incredibly important to have the end goal, our purpose in life in mind. And that's God's glory. And we're called to pray that into our hearts daily. Every single day we begin our prayers after addressing God as Father, after knowing that foundation of the gospel. It therefore creates in us the desire to glorify God's name. You see, that purpose of glorifying God is built on the foundation of our relationship as adopted daughters and sons of the one who made the universe. It's built on the gospel. And once we truly understand the gospel, we can therefore say, God, first and foremost, your name be glorified. Your name be set apart. Your name needs to be the fundamental orienting reality to every single thing that I pray. So when I'm going to pray about a problem I have, about a sickness someone has, about a circumstance coming up, all of that is oriented, and not in such a way that my name is primarily glorified, but so God's name is glorified. Psalm 115, this is why the psalmist prays in Psalm 115, not to us, so the psalm begins, not to us, O Lord, but to your name we give glory for the sake of your steadfast love and your faithfulness. He has to say, not to me, but you. And that's how you begin your prayers after addressing God as Father. The response that orients everything is not me. My name's not going to be glorified for all of eternity, but God's is. And once you begin to do that, the rest of your prayers are oriented to the love of God and love of neighbor. Thanks, church.